Hello, I'm Nick, and this is Today in Philosophy of History for Wednesday, 29 May 2024. It is the 144th anniversary of the birth of Oswald Spengler, who was born in Blankenburg, Germany on this date in 1880. It is also the 571st anniversary of the fall of Constantinople to the Turks, which took place on 29 May 1453. So Spengler was born on the 427th anniversary of the fall of Constantinople. And there's a kind of poetic appropriateness to Spengler being born on the same day as the end of the last trace of an ancient civilization, since Spengler was to go on to write about the decline of Western civilization. In The Decline of the West, which is a big book, Der Untergang des Abendlandes, the first volume was published in 1918, just as the First World War was coming to an end, and the second volume was published in 1922. In this book, anyway, Byzantium does not play a particularly large role, but in the second volume, we find this interesting observation. Quote, "Here, layer after layer has to be carefully separated. In 326, Constantine, rebuilding on the ruins of this great city destroyed by Septimus Severus, created a late classical cosmopolis of the first rank, into which presently steamed hoary Apollonism from the west and youthful magism from the east. And long afterwards again, in 1096, it is the late Magian cosmopolis confronted in his last autumn days with the spring in the shape of Godfrey of Bouillon's crusaders, whom that clever royal lady Anna Comnena portrays with contempt. As the easternmost of the classical West, this city bewitched the Goths. Then, a millennium later, as the northernmost of the Arabian world, it enchanted the Russians. And the amazing Vasily Blazheny in Moscow, 1554, the herald of Russian pre-culture, stands between styles, just as 2,000 years before, Solomon's temple had stood between Babylon, the cosmopolis, and early Christianity," unquote. For Spengler, Byzantium hovers between what he calls the Apollonian and the Magian, which is to say, between the ancient West and the East. Throughout his book, Spengler's interest is in an exposition of three fundamentally different outlooks on life: the Apollonian, the Magian, and the Faustian. The Apollonian is essentially that of classical antiquity. The Magian is Persian and Arabic civilization, and the Faustian is modern Western civilization. Many other outlooks on life and many other civilizations are mentioned, but these three are really at the center of Spengler's account of history. Given this way of laying things out, there's a fundamental difference between ancient and contemporary Western civilizations, which manifest different outlooks on life. Since Spengler cleaves Western civilization in two in this way, it counts as two distinct civilizations in his catalog of civilizations. Spengler is often said to distinguish a discrete number of civilizations, or rather high cultures that decline into civilizations, because early in the first volume, Spengler argues that a society begins as a culture, becomes a high culture, and after it passes into its decline is then a civilization. That hasn't picked up much currency. It's not widely adopted, but it's one of the peculiarities of Spengler's thought. It might be worth knowing about. In John Fennelly's book on Spengler, Twilight of the Evening Lands, Oswald Spengler, half century later, Fennelly lays out the way he sees it like this. Quote, "Thus, in place of the linear concept of history leading up to and culminating in a picture of his own times, Spengler presents the story of 8 separate high cultures of the human race, no one of which is considered more important than any of the others. These 8 are the Babylonian, the Indian, the Chinese, the Egyptian, the classical, the culture of Greece and Rome, the Arabian, also called the Magian by Spengler, the West European or Faustian, and finally, the Mayan Aztec culture of Mexico," unquote. Spengler doesn't really reel off a list of civilizations in any kind of explicit way in his book. He is the antithesis of a schematic writer. So it's not how he presents his account to the reader. Spengler's exposition is rather dense, detailed, and sometimes repetitious, what anthropologists would call a thick description. It wouldn't be too far off to say that the whole of the decline of the West is a thick description of the Apollonian, Magian, and Faustian civilizations and the people who built these civilizations. Because Spengler's exposition is dense and difficult to understand, he has attracted not only admirers, but also expositors. Fahrenkopf's book about Spengler locates Spengler within the traditions of positivism and historicism. Quote, Spengler denied the capacity of the historical philosopher to derive scientific laws in imitation of the natural scientist. Real history is heavy with destiny, but free of laws. However, his daring project to uncover the master pattern of world history certainly bears some resemblance to the enterprise of historical positivists to discover historical laws. While German historicism was essentially ideographic in orientation, Spengler, his own protest to the contrary, with his methodical systematization and patternization of history, was largely nomothetic in approach, as were positivist historians. His aspiration to predictive powers also certainly places him in proximity to the positivist tradition, unquote. That's from page 84 of Fahrenkopf's book. When we think too much in terms of labels, we tend to tie ourselves in knots, and in this case, to little avail. Fahrenkopf's exposition of Spengler is weakened in this way by his reliance on familiar categories like positivism and historicism. For example, Fahrenkopf claims that Spengler belongs among the positivists. Were there positivists who sought to discover historical laws? Yes, certainly there were. Carl Hempel came from the tradition of logical empiricism, and he formulated the covering law model of historical explanation. But there are good reasons we don't associate this school of thought with the kind of substantive philosophy of history that Spengler represents. Otto Neurath, who was a leader among the logical positivists, one of the Vienna Circle, and an editor of the International Encyclopedia of Unified Scientists, wrote an entire book against Spengler. In his anti-Spengler, Neurath wrote, quote, "It is not the individual wrong results, the wrong facts, the wrong proofs that make Spengler's book so dangerous, but above all his method of conducting proofs and his reflections on proof as such. Against this one must defend oneself. Anyone who wants to shape a happier future with hope and striving should know that none of Spengler's proofs is enough to prevent him. And whoever wishes to come to terms with the idea of decline should know that he does so on the basis of a resolution and not a proof," unquote. And Neurath enters that sentence with an exclamation point, not something often used by philosophers. So this is what one positivist himself has to say about Spengler. But it should suffice to read any paragraph out of Spengler, and it's very clear that he is not any kind of a positivist, not in the mold of earlier positivists like Comte, and certainly not in the mold of the logical positivists. Neurath was, you could say, the epitome of a schematic intellect, which is why he cooked up the idea of the International Encyclopedia of Unified Sciences, and he created his graphical symbol system called isotype, which is familiar to us today on countless traffic signs around the world. So it would be difficult to find two men more temperamentally divergent than Spengler and Neurath. Spengler did not see himself as a positivist, and the positivists did not count him as one of their own. Fahrenkopf at one point appeals to Igger's book, The German Conception of History, which is largely about historicism. So I looked to see what Iggers had to say about Spengler, and Iggers wrote this, quote, The path from the classical idea of progress to Spengler's conception of doom is not as great as it might appear. There is a degree of continuity in the very different analyses of the dominant trends of history and of the character of the age by thinkers as diverse as Condorcet, J.S. Mill, Weber, and Spengler. All saw the irresistible scientification and technicalization of life and thought. Only rationality and enlightenment, which for Condorcet had been absolutely positive factors in the liberation of man, now increasingly appeared as a threat to human values. For Spengler, they became the very antithesis to life and spirit. The heroic qualities of the knight and the priest replaced the humanistic and humanitarian values of the West. To Troeltsch, the decline of the West seemed an invitation to barbarism and itself an active contribution to the decline of the West. Nevertheless, Troeltsch's cumbersome essays were rarely read, while Spengler's book became a Bible and a source of inspiration for tens of thousands, unquote. Eger's discussion of historicism is, in my opinion, among the best that can be found, and he doesn't especially tie Spengler to historicism. However, here the label is somewhat justified if we understand by historicism the taking of each age on its own terms, judging it on its own standards and not by the standards of another age. This is most definitely central to Spengler's method, but most labels don't work very well with Spengler. The nomothetic and ideographic labels that Fahrenkopf uses don't work very well with Spengler, and the linear and cyclical history labels don't work very well with Spengler either. It's better to set aside familiar labels and any attempt at a schematization when reading Spengler and try to enter into the labels that Spengler himself furnishes, as with the Apollonian, Magian, and Faustian civilizations. More than most philosophers of history, Spengler belongs to no philosophical school except the school he built for himself. In a letter to Georg Misch, Spengler wrote, quote, "I am not the product of any school of philosophy. Rather, these ideas have somehow condensed from mathematics, history, painting, and literature into a metaphysical whole," unquote. Being the product of no extant school of thought, he didn't have to please anyone except himself. And like Toynbee's A Study of History, the decline of the West was not really aimed at academic philosophers of history, but it is at the same time a demanding work that does not hesitate to delve into metaphysical questions. In a letter to Albert Erich Brinkmann, Spengler wrote of his recently published book, a copy of which he sent to Brinkmann, quote, "Although the book is concerned with the philosophy of history in general, and is therefore basically physical, abstract, and even metaphysical, yet as the result of a new method and the posing of the problems, it is always in close connection with the most concrete facts and has dealt specially with art and the details of its form and development more thoroughly than hitherto has usually been possible. It is my conviction that in this an important new turning has been taken," unquote. On the opening page of The Decline of the West, Spengler described his project with admirable clarity and does so by asking a series of questions. Quote, "Is there a logic of history? Is there, beyond all the casual and incalculable elements of the separate events, something that we may call a metaphysical structure of historic humanity, something that is essentially independent of the outward forms of social, spiritual, and political, which we see so clearly? Are not these actualities indeed secondary or derived from that something? Does world history present to the seeing eye certain grand traits again and again with sufficient constancy to justify certain conclusions? And if so, what are the limits to which reasoning from such premises may be pushed?" Unquote. Spengler embraced the philosophical and metaphysical dimensions of his work, contrary to the rising positivism of the era. But he was not giving exposition of a particular philosophical doctrine or a particular philosophical school. Spengler was not himself an academic, though he worked as a teacher until he received a modest inheritance upon which he lived for the rest of his life. So that made him an outsider, and he remains an outsider even today. There is no article on Spengler in either the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy or the Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy. And I think that Spengler being an outsider had something to do with the success of his book, which made him briefly very famous in the interwar period in Germany. The social sciences in his time were increasingly coming under the influence of Franz Boas' cultural relativism, which decisively rejected the earlier cultural evolutionism of Edward Burnett Tylor, Lewis Henry Morgan, and Marx, which was becoming eclipsed in academia as a result of Boas's influence. Spengler, working in near isolation, produced a philosophy of history that employed some familiar ideas of cultural evolutionism just as this space was being abandoned by others, so that the book fell on fertile ground of those who find cultural evolutionism an intuitive way of looking at history and civilizations. Of course, cultural evolutionism is just another label, and it is an awkward label for what Spengler was doing, but in time, there are places where it is a justified label. There's another side to Spengler's thought, such as the incommensurability of civilizations, which is closer to Boas's cultural relativism. And that is another obvious reason for avoiding familiar categories in describing Spengler's project. Whether or not I'm right about this, about Spengler's book inhabiting the space of cultural evolutionism at a time when others were leaving that space, Boas's student, Ruth Benedict, nevertheless discussed Spengler in her influential study, Patterns of Culture. Quote, "The confused impression which is given by Spengler's volumes is due only partially to the manner of presentation. To an even greater degree, it is the consequence of the unresolved complexities of the civilizations with which he deals. Western civilizations, with their historical diversity, their stratification into occupations and classes, their incomparable richness of detail, and are not yet well enough understood to be summarized under a couple of catchwords. Outside of certain very restricted intellectual and artistic circles, Faustian man, if he occurs, does not have his own way with our civilization. There are the strong men of action and the Babbitts as well as the Faustians, and no ethnologically satisfactory picture of modern civilization can ignore such constantly reoccurring types. It is quite as convincing to characterize our cultural type as a thoroughly extrovert, running about in endless mundane activity, inventing, governing, and, as Edward Carpenter says, endlessly catching its train, as it is to characterize it as Faustian with a longing for the infinite." Unquote. So that's Ruth Benedict on Spengler. Benedict discusses Spengler for several pages. By the time she published Patterns of Culture in 1934, the Spengler wave had already crested, but he had become so widely discussed that it was more or less obligatory to mention Spengler in relation to the problems of civilization, even if only to dismiss him. Note that Benedict writes of the confused impression that Spengler's book leaves. It's become a kind of pro forma obligation not only to mention Spengler in the context of a discussion of civilization, but also to portray his work as confused or overly complex or turgid or not really meant to be understood. We can find a similar dismissal of Spengler in Henry Frankfurt's The Birth of Civilization in the Near East, which is a fascinating mixture of accuracy and invective. Quote, "Oswald Spengler's Decline of the West was first published in 1917 and bears the subtitle Outline of a Morphology of World History. This indicates that the aspect of form, as we have called it, is fully considered in his work. In this resides, as a matter of fact, the element of lasting worth of his sensational, arrogant, and pompous volumes. They were written as a reaction against the prevalent view of history, which was prejudiced in two respects. It considered world history exclusively from the Western standpoint, and it presumed with evolutionary optimism that history exemplified the progress of humanity. For Spengler, the word humanity isn't merely an empty phrase. The great civilizations are unconnected. They are self-contained organisms of so individual a nature that people who belong to one cannot understand the achievements and modes of thought of another. He maintains that not even in science does knowledge show accumulations transcending the limits of one's civilization." This is largely on point, both in terms of where it agrees with his work and as an accurate summary. Benedict, too, is often on point with Spengler. She is right that the complexities of the civilizations that Spengler discussed pose limitations on what can coherently be said of them. But it could be argued that Spengler responds to this complexity by formulating a complex account that seeks to do them justice. This is what I earlier called a thick description, and my guess is that Benedict, as an anthropologist, was drawn into Spengler by this aspect of his work. I think, by the way, the term thick description is due to Clifford Geertz, but I didn't look that up prior to recording this. I said above that Spengler's account employs many familiar ideas of cultural evolutionism. Here is how Ruth Benedict expresses these ideas in how they appear in Spengler's work. Quote, "These cultural configurations have, like any organism, a span of life they cannot overpass. This thesis of the doom of civilizations is argued on the basis of the shift of cultural centers in Western civilization and the periodicity of high cultural achievement. He buttresses this description with the analogy, which can never be more than an analogy, with the birth and death cycle of living organisms. Every civilization, he believes, has its lusty youth, its strong manhood, and its disintegrating senescence," unquote. That was Ruth Benedict again on Spengler. These cultural evolutionary themes are clearly present in Spengler, but as I said, there are also elements in Spengler that could be assimilated to the cultural relativist model, insofar as Spengler characterizes each civilization in strongly ideographic terms, such that civilizations are essentially incommensurable, which is the point that Henry Frankfurt emphasized. Civilizations rise up out of a population, pass through their stages, and then recede again. But each such episode of rising up and receding is unique, even if the stages of development are repeated in each and every civilization. In the following paragraph from Spengler, we can see the themes of cultural relativism and cultural evolutionism entwined together. Quote, "Mankind has no aim, no idea, no plan, any more than the family of butterflies or orchids. Mankind is a zoological expression or an empty word, but conjure away the phantom, break the magic circle, and at once there emerges an astonishing wealth of actual forms, the living with all its immense fullness, depth, and movement, hitherto veiled by a catchword, a dry-as-dust scheme, and a set of personal ideals. I see, in place of that empty figment of one linear history, which can only be kept up by shutting one's eyes to the overwhelming multitude of the facts, the drama of a number of mighty cultures, each springing with primitive strength from the soil of a mother region to which it remains firmly bound throughout its whole life cycle, each stamping its material, its mankind, in its own image, each having its own idea, its own passions, its own life, will, and feeling, its own death. Here indeed are colors, lights, movements with that no intellectual eye has yet discovered. Here the cultures, peoples, languages, truths, gods, landscapes bloom and age as the oaks and the stone pines, the blossoms, twigs, and leaves, but there is no aging mankind. Each culture has its own new possibilities of self-expression, which arise, ripen, decay, and never return. There is not one sculpture, one painting, one mathematics, one physics, but many, each in its deepest essence different from the others, each limited in duration and self-contained, each as one species of plants has its peculiar blossom or fruit, its special type of growth and decline. These cultures, sublimated life essences, grow with the same superb aimlessness of the flowers of the field. They belong, like the plants and the animals, to the living nature of Goethe and not to the dead nature of Newton. I see world history as a picture of endless formations and transformations, of the marvelous waxing and waning of organic forms. The professional historian, on the contrary, sees it as a sort of tapeworm, industriously adding on to itself one epoch after another," unquote. Unlike Hegel, to which Spengler is often compared, there is in Spengler no development of absolute spirit as it passes through stages of development embodied in different civilizations. There isn't even any cumulative scientific knowledge or technical expertise. For Spengler, all the civilizations are the same in the sense that each is unique. Each developed according to its own internal principles, but none contributes to any overall development in history. History on the whole has no direction. It does not exhibit progress, and for the same reason, it does not consist of any overall cycle, notwithstanding the frequent attribution to Spengler of a cyclical philosophy of history. Neither is it linear, and not only is each culture unique, but each has its own unique science and mathematics, a claim that is often implicit in others, but rarely is argued explicitly. There is some similarity here with Danilevsky, who argues for a few familiar cultural historical types rather than Spengler's unfinished and unaging mankind, which does not seem to be limited by the number of types that Danilevsky laid out. Danilevsky also allows that different cultures can have different sciences, but he did not insist that all must have distinct sciences, all but incommensurable with the sciences of other societies. For Spengler, philosophy, like science, is the expression of a culture. Quote, "There is no such thing as philosophy in itself. Every culture has its own philosophy, which is a part of its total symbolic expression and forms with its posing of problems and methods of thought an intellectual ornamentation that is closely related to that of architecture and the arts of form. From the high and distant standpoint, it matters very little what truths thinkers have managed to formulate in words within their respective schools. For here, as in every great art, it is the school's conventions and repertory of forms that are the basic elements. Infinitely more important than the answers are the questions and the choice of them, the inner form of them. For it is the particular way in which a macrocosm presents itself to the understanding of man of a particular culture that determines a priori the whole necessity of asking them and the way in which they are asked," unquote. And so it goes with every aspect of human life and experience in Spengler. One might ask how Spengler can formulate a theory that applies to a multiplicity of cultures when every culture is unique, philosophically and scientifically distinct from every other culture. This is a problem for all relativisms, and it is or would be a problem for Spengler if we were to try to translate Spengler into a schematic doctrine of civilization. But that's not how Spengler worked, and it's not how Spengler thought. We have to take Spengler at his own terms, as though his is one of those culturally bound philosophies that is an intellectual ornamentation that is closely related to architecture and the arts of form. Spengler, you could say, gives us an architectonic of civilization, and it is a vision peculiar to Spengler. Many writers have many things to say about Spengler, which is one of the reasons I have emphasized the need to avoid labels in talking about him. Many have said that his history is cyclical, while some say it's linear. Some say Spengler's method is nomothetic, others say that it is ideographic. Some say his book is unscientific, and some say it is wrong because it tries to be scientific. So the decline of the West is like the Quito doubloon nailed to the mast of the Pequod in Moby Dick. Melville has Captain Ahab pause and reflect on the coin, saying to himself, quote, "This round globe is but the image of the rounder globe, which, like a magician's glass, to each and every man in turn but mirrors back his own mysterious self," unquote. Spengler's The Decline of the West mirrors back to every man his own mysterious self. And the book itself is mysterious. It not only avoids summary and schematism, it resists any attempt at summary and schematism. And in this way, Spengler's book is true to the cultures and civilizations he studied and believed to be unique, incomprehensible, and irreducible to any other. And in this respect, we can compare Spengler to Ibn Khaldun and the Muqaddimah, which is similarly indigenous to its milieu and difficult to extract from the peculiarities of its historical, social, and cultural context. So happy birthday, Oswald Spengler, and thanks for listening.